Three, two, one, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in a DeLorean? Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly? Hakeem, Hakeem, well, we're here to stay. Hakeem, Hakeem, it's another day. I don't know why I don't even remember where that's from. It just came into my brain.
I wish I knew how to vibe with that. I would have joined in. I don't know the male role.
I don't know that that's a gendered.
We should do a musical.
Oh my God, a Does It Fly podcast music would be pretty darn funny.
a Grease spoof.
Don't get me started.
Well, I have a friend who always at karaoke would make me sing the summertime, na 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 na, whatever, however that goes. Yeah.
Well, the funny thing about Grease is that it is timeless in the sense that I dressed as a pink lady for Halloween. My kiddo at one point dressed as a pink. Every generation seems to get it, but yet, ironically, watching it now, the message of that movie is horrible.
What is the message? You know what I read somewhere is that it was all her having a dream. It wasn't real events. That's why everything works out.
I'm not buying that. There's no suggestion for that. No, the message of the movie is that for a guy to like you, you have to change yourself, look like what he wants you to look like, and be slutty.
And?
Like I said.
Listen, it's like a dude. For a girl to like you, you got to change yourself, be honorable and upstanding. No dude's honorable and upstanding. No. I'm teasing.
I don't know.
But no, it's my favorite American philosopher is Chris Rock. And many years ago, he said, when you meet someone, you don't meet them, you meet their representative. And now that I've lived a few decades, I'm like, maybe he has a point there. You meet their representative.
Interesting. Well, that's kind of a perfect intro into our show today because we are talking about one of the comic's biggest Playboy characters, at least at the beginning. We are talking about Iron Man.
Iron Man. And when I think of human evolution, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, he sounds like a dude from the Iron Age. Iron Man, his first dude to smelt iron. When I was a kid, I remember when I was first told about Iron Man as a kid. Yeah. My cousins, when I moved to Mississippi, 9 years old. And at that time, I thought the name was ridiculous. A dude in a iron suit. I mean, I love Iron Man, but
sure.
It just seemed too simplistic, even to my 9-year-old mind. Iron Man. We're not just talking about all of Iron Man. We're talking about, a particular piece of Iron Man technology.
That's
the
right.
ARC Reactor.
Yes. And so we're going to, obviously, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is quite vast. So as with a lot of the franchises we talk about that are big and roaming, we're going to hone in on one particular thing. So we're going to talk about the ARC Reactor sort of for the first chunk of Iron Man stuff. So basically from Iron Man 1, 2, and 3, which spanned the first movie, which came out in 2008, directed by Jon Favreau, which kicked off the whole MCU, and then to 2 and 3, which really kind of completes the arc, no pun intended.
Yes, you did. You intended that pun.
Maybe. No, I've got a worse one later, so wait for it. Of Iron Man story. And within there, you've also got The Avengers, which came out in 2012. Iron Man 3 actually came out after The Avengers in 2013. So that's the little chunk of the MCU that we're going to talk about today. And as always, our show comes in 3 parts, right? Hakeem's going to look at the science of the ARC reactor. Could it exist? Would it exist? What are the possibilities? I'm going to look at the story world that they've created and the what if. Does it stay consistent? Is it something we want to live in? And then we're both going to look at, does it fly for the vibes?
And do we want to even have a world where an ARC reactor exists? It may already be in the works tomorrow.
All right. I look
So
forward to hearing about that. Like I said, these movies started in 2008, so we're going to guess that most people listening have probably seen them already. But because we're talking about these stories, there will be spoilers. So if you have not
yes,
seen them and don't want them
yes.
spoiled, now would be the time to hit pause, go watch, come back, watch us. And I also do feel the need to say a lot of people know that I do a lot of work with Marvel. I'm their red carpet host and have had the privilege of talking to a lot of folks, both creators in front of and behind the camera. This is a separate podcast. This is me, Tamara, not saying anything official as a Marvel person. This is just me as me on Does It Fly. So like disclaimer out, science in. Science me up,
All right,
Hakeem.
all right. So let me join you there. So in terms of like my Hollywood experience, you know, I'm somewhat like Hollywood adjacent, right?
What does that mean?
Well, I do television stuff, but typically not in Southern California. I'm out
Yeah.
somewhere in an Airbnb or in a field or something like that. It's true. It's true.
You're corresponding.
I'm a correspondent, yeah, a contributor, and sometimes judge or co-host, but rarely in a studio. But I got two opportunities to hang out with the cast members of two science fiction empires that I love.
Yeah.
One was Star Trek. In the MCU, I had a chance to spend several hours with Chadwick Boseman before he passed, the day
Amazing.
before Infinity War came out, and
Mhm.
also with Winston Scott. And so it's interesting, after spending like 2 hours or so, 3 hours or so with Chad, we go to this event at the El Capitan Theater. And when he introduces me to Winston Scott, he goes, "Hey, Hakeem's an astrophysicist." And then he goes, "Oh, word?" And he starts asking me questions about the universe. So that's
Nice.
my only adjacency. And I'm so envious that you got to met Captain America and
Yeah,
Tony Stark. And
I've interviewed a lot of tall guys named Chris.
what do you think, Tamara, about me going to, say, I don't know, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and taking a nuclear reactor and sticking it in your chest?
Yeah,
How
that
does
doesn't
that
sound so
sound?
good. That doesn't sound so good.
No, it does
I'm not
not
on board with
sound
that.
good.
No.
Tony Stark, what are you doing, man? You're sticking a nuclear reactor in your chest. Should I just jump to the end right now? And
No,
then give my
I
explanation?
want the science. I want the science.
All right. Man, Tony Stark is tripping. He did not build no damn miniature ARC reactor and stick it in his chest and survive to tell the story.
Okay.
That did not happen. Didn't happen, Tony.
Okay, tell me why. Give me the science.
Okay, first off, an ARC reactor is something that actually exists. We call it a tokamak reactor. Probably weighs thousands of tons.
Okay.
and they barely have solved the biggest problem of plasma crashes like yesterday. Not literally yesterday, but these things are notorious. They've been in development for decades, and they're notorious for these plasma instabilities. So it must generate a plasma in order to generate fusion. And that plasma is confined using magnetic fields, because if it's not, it'll touch the sides and it'll lose energy to the sides, right? So you need this orderly thing in order to create this fusion process. And there are certain issues that come up because things are moving. It's not like a rod, it's not like a stick of palladium. It's a little liquid vial. A plasma is essentially a gas that's charged, that has an electric charge. It's very rarefied. And you can lose particles if they, instead of colliding, they can lose energy to the walls. They have to collide with enough energy to power the fusion process. And so, we're at a point now where fusion reactions are finally getting net positive energy output.
So wait, so back up for a second. So is fusion then, can you just clarify the relationship between plasma and fusion? Is fusion the result of colliding plasma particles?
Right. So when you look at this plasma, they use particular types of atomic species. All right.
Okay.
And so the most common are, in the sun, if you look at proton, it comes in 3 types. So what determines the identity of a particular element is the number of is literally the electric charge on its nucleus. But the electric charge of the nucleus is related to the number of protons in the nucleus. Okay? So one proton equals hydrogen. But there's a second nuclear particle that does not have an electric charge. So you can add those to the nucleus and you don't change the type of, it's still hydrogen, but it now becomes what is known as an isotope of hydrogen. So a single proton by itself, we call it the isotope of protonium or something like that, but it's based off proton, right? Protonium.
Is that so? Again, like me asking all my dumb science questions, things I feel like
There
I
are no
probably
dumb
learned in
questions.
like high school chemistry, but don't
Yeah.
remember. So is that what they mean, for example, like when you talk about like a heavy element, like heavy uranium or heavy, like, is that
Yeah,
an
you've
isotope?
added more neutrons than normal,
Right.
right?
So you haven't changed the charge, but you've added more. Okay.
Exactly. You've added more mass without adding more charge.
Thank you,
Exactly.
Professor O. I appreciate the explanation.
Anytime, my favorite student. So if you add one neutron to the proton, now they're bound, a neutron proton system, that's called deuterium. And if you have two neutrons with one proton, that's called tritium because it's three nuclear particles. Okay. So if you look at the single proton, the deuterium, and the tritium, there are different ways that they can combine to fuse. So the sun, deuterium is the one that is the most readily fusible.
Okay.
All right. So that's the main ingredient in these. But you also need a second element or a second isotope. So most commonly it's tritium. But the issue is radiation, right? So the byproducts, fusion has less radiation than does fission, but still, you want to avoid as many byproducts as possible. So one people look at is a form of helium. And so people are like, oh, we can mine the moon because the sun has been shining helium on the moon for billions of years. And so now in the lunar regolith, you have this helium isotope in there. So instead of using tritium, which is itself radioactive, we could use this helium isotope, which is less radioactive. And so we have less radioactive output. But anyway, the point is that each of these ions or these isotopes have a positive electric charge. And so to fuse, you want them to collide. And just like if you drop something in the gravitational field, it will spontaneously go from high gravitational potential energy to lower gravitational potential energy. In doing so, some energy is created. And that energy in this case is the thing goes faster and faster. It gets more, right? So when inside of an atom or a nucleus, when they go from higher energy to lower energy, they typically give off that energy difference as light, right? Light comes out that has a difference in energy to the pre-state and the post-state. So you get them together and boom, the two things coming together, if you weigh them, they weigh a certain amount. But when they stick together, the combination weighs less.
Because they've given stuff off. Yeah.
Because they've given stuff off, right?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
love all of that, but I'm not
Right.
sure how it relates to the ARC reactor. So
Because
like,
the ARC reactor is a fusion reactor. It's a
Okay,
fusion
got it.
reactor. So in order for nature to create fusion, it needs the core of a star.
Mhm.
And even then, so here's the thing. These things have the same electric charge, so they are repelled from each other. All right?
Right.
So in the star, you got to get it to the magic temperature, about 10 billion degrees in this high density environment. So the hotter it gets, that means the faster stuff is moving, right?
Yeah.
And so as two protons approach each other, or two deuterons, they feel each other's electric repulsion, they veer away. But the faster they go, the closer they get before they veer away, right?
Yeah.
And so it's at a magic distance of, take 10 millimeters. No. Take a millimeter, all right, and divide that by 1,000,000 equal parts.
Totally in my head. Done.
Done. Now take one of those and divide it by another 1,000,000 equal parts. All right.
Okay.
That distance is how close you got to get those deuterons to each other for them to fuse. a millimeter divided by a million divided by the million. Okay. Even then, they should not fuse. But on the small scales of the atomic world, there's this magic thing that occurs that's called quantum tunneling. So what happens is, under those conditions, some of them can quantum tunnel through and fuse. So you have to have a lot of energy in it, and you have to have a high density and a high temperature, right? So that a lot of energy, high temperature, same thing. So, there's two ways we do fusion here on Earth today. Well, there's more than two ways, but there's two promising ways. One way is they take a fuel pellet, and put it in this capsule. And they shine some of the world's most powerful lasers, several of them, into that capsule, and vaporizes the capsule, which creates X-rays.
Mhm.
All right?
Okay.
Those X-rays bombard that particular fuel pellet and makes the outside of it fly away. And because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, because the outside goes out, the inside goes in. And you get that fusion of moving those things in close to each other. And this is the fusion that has actually gotten the net positive energy out. It's the only type of fusion, even though there are many. There's a thing called a dense plasma focus. There's a tokamak. There's this type of method using lasers. The tokamak, there is no way to miniaturize it currently known in order, like Tony Stark is doing. Like, they've had one at Princeton for a long time. They're building one in Japan now that is, up and running now, I think, recently. But these things are humongous. Like, they weigh like gazillions of tons. Like, they're crazy heavy and big.
Wait, why? Okay, so why do they need to be so big?
That's the question, right? That's the question.
Yeah,
So
ask the questions. You give the answer.
yeah, so it's about energy considerations. Just like with a cyclotron, although it's a different thing. With a cyclotron, the energy scales with the size of the ring that you're accelerating them around, right? So there's a relationship between the size of the thing and the energy generation that you can generate with current engineering and technology. In full disclosure, I don't know the exact mathematical law. Like in the cyclotron, we have the cyclotron equation that makes it very obvious why you have to make it bigger and bigger, and you could get like unlimited energy the bigger you make it.
Pause for
With
one
the
second.
tokamak, I don't know that equation.
Wait,
Yeah.
cyclotron. Cyclotron is particle accelerator?
Oh, that's what these particle accelerators, right?
Okay.
That's what Ernest O. Lawrence won the Nobel Prize for, discovering the cyclotron equation, which allows us to build these. And just coincidentally, I was a Ernest Lawrence postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Berkeley Lab in the opening years of this century.
Very fancy. Very fancy.
Yeah,
Sorry, I just
but I
wanted
wasn't
to
doing
make
cyclotron
sure.
physics.
Just wanted to make sure I was understanding exactly what it was, and and also
Right.
for
But-
folks listening who may think a cyclotron is a circus ride, which I would understand because it sounds like something you'd get on a motorcycle.
Ooh, I think I have seen a circus ride called the cyclotron.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But let's get to the ARC reactor. So having a fusion reactor of that sort, miniaturized that way with that much power, ain't happening. But now let's look at how it's used, because now we can look at the biological aspects. So there's three ways in which this ARC reactor is used. The first way was Tony Stark had shrapnel in his chest that was moving toward his heart, and he created this ARC reactor to have a magnetic pull in the opposite direction to keep the shrapnel from descending into his heart. The second thing is it's a power source. Powers Iron Man suits, powers more. The third thing is he creates energy blasts out of it sometimes. He has the repulsors on his hand, but then he has the blast out of his chest directly out of the ARC reactor, right? So let's start with the first one. It's his own shrapnel that's in his chest. Right? It was a Stark Industries rocket that exploded. Like, I don't know what's going on there, but nowadays, such exploding ordnance sends out titanium balls. Super hard. And here's the deal with titanium. I got a titanium screw in my shoulder right here, right now. You should see the X-ray. It's really cool because the way it scatters, it makes the screw look way bigger than it really is. So it looks like I got this stake in my thing. But the thing about titanium is that it's non-magnetic. So if he had titanium shrapnel in his chest, which would be a modern weapon, right? It wouldn't work.
Do you know how long titanium's been the standard?
Since right before Stark Industries was founded.
And titanium
It's
is a
definitely a
standard for
21st century thing.
okay, alright.
Yeah.
And
Before
that's
we
what would be
were,
used for weapons. Okay.
yeah, you want something very hard and dense. And so, there's like depleted uranium,
Mhm.
titanium. Um, Although it doesn't have it's not as dense. It is definitely hard.
Okay.
Um, Now, next thing is as a power source. So if he really did have an actual tokamak in his chest, yeah, you could use
Mhm.
that as a power source. Of course, that's what they're for, and it would
Okay.
be virtually unlimited. But here's the thing, though: you have to power the tokamak itself in order to get the electricity out of it, right? So,
Yeah.
how did he initially do that? But the thing about it is, if there's a nuclear reactor in your chest,
Mhm.
that sounds like you're dying day one. Like, that-
I
I
mean,
don't.
okay.
You're dead, dude. You're not putting a nuclear reactor in your chest. And let's not talk about the energy blast,
Mhm.
because for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction,
Mhm.
right? So, what is holding that thing there such that it doesn't just boof through his back?
Right. Yeah. I like that
So
official
yeah,
phrase, "Boof through his back."
yeah, just like poof, you see a hole, just a circular hole. Then he plugs
Right.
it with a new arc reactor.
Yeah,
Every time he
exactly.
uses it, he has to have another one.
Right.
'Cause that's how he gets the enemy in front of him and the one behind him.
That's true. It's strategic. It's definitely strategic.
Yeah, he's like he's just shooting arc reactors at everyone. But yeah,
Right.
so I think the arc reactor is closely, it almost sounds like cold fusion in a
Mhm.
way, right? But cold
Yeah.
fusion wasn't giving you that kind of power out. But here's the other thing that's really interesting. He starts off with palladium, which is a real element,
Yeah.
as a central necessary element. But then he invents this new material from, I think his father had discovered it or something like that. And he calls it
Thorium.
badassium.
Yeah.
That's what I drink every morning. Most people call it coffee, but badassium is real
Right.
and it's full of energy.
Oh god.
A
So
nice cup of
I am getting
badassium.
so I am then getting the sense that, your definitive answer to does the science of the arc reactor fly is
No, the science of the arc reactor does not fly for even a nanosecond. It is not happening.
big crash and burn. Big
Big
crash.
crash and burn, unless the Daleks come and they have some new technology that we don't know about or something.
Okay.
But man. But if you could, oh boy, if you could,
Yeah. Well, so that leads into the story piece of it, the what
yeah,
if, right?
yeah.
So, okay, so as we've talked about, good sci-fi gives you a what if, and then it sets up a world, and then as it takes you for a ride, on the what if train, are there bumps or is it smooth sailing? Okay.
Yes.
So, when it comes to Iron Man and the arc reactor, I'm the first to admit, yes, there's a bunch of bumps on the train, right? Like on the
Ooh,
story train. So things
tell
like,
me.
things like, okay, so he's got the shrapnel, and especially in the first Iron Man, but also in subsequent movies, we hear a lot about like the shrapnel going to his heart, and it needs to keep it out of and away from his heart. My brain goes to, but what about the other organs in his body? Like, aren't there other things that these little mini, they're almost like little mini knives or projectiles? Like, aren't there other parts of his body we're worried about them slicing up or dicing up or damaging? There's that. Another bump is like the massive hole in his chest.
Right.
Right? So,
Yeah.
just looking, from the very moment that he's in the cave, and we know that Yinsen has, Yinsen
Wait
Ho.
a minute.
Yeah.
You got to say it properly. The very sanitary cave. Let's.
Oh, yeah, it is not a sanitary cave. Definitely no infection happening there.
Yeah.
Definitely, not any kind of health hazards going on there. When it starts, he's got, basically got this sort of thing plugged to keep the a makeshift thing to keep the shrapnel from going to his heart, and he's hooked up to a car battery to create
Right.
the
Yeah.
magnetized field that we need. I can buy that, but it is very disconcerting to see this big hole. And then we see that, throughout. Like,
Yeah.
part of this is that there's this essentially containment chamber, and as he creates new versions of the ARC reactor, it gets plugged in and plugged out, and
Yeah.
there's a great scene with Robert Downey Jr. and Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, where he calls her down to the lab at the bottom of the house, and he needs her help in switching out the arc reactor, and she has to like stick her hand in and find the right
Yeah.
circuit. And it's a great play on like the whole sort of like, let's disarm the bomb. Is it the blue wire or the red wire? But it's like goopy and biological, but also mechanical. It's really fun, and it's a great scene where you sort of see
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
dynamic
Love that
explored.
scene.
But like he's walking around with this hole in his chest for many of these movies. So like that maybe bumps me a little. And yes, to your point, like so then he creates the arc reactor, the mini arc reactor, while he's in the cave in Afghanistan. And like in addition to the sanitary conditions, it's also like, could he really put this together in a cave?
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave.
Would he really have what he needs there? So like there's that question. And then when it comes to powering the suit, it constantly is running out of power. So like
Yeah.
you would think maybe he'd have some backup batteries. Like you would think maybe he's figured out a way to do that.
Yeah.
So these are all things that bump, right? Like as
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
going on this what if train. However, you cannot forget that you are also riding on the what if train of Iron Man with Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. And they are masters.
Yeah.
So,
Killed it.
I mean, this is Iron Man. The first Iron Man is the Marvel Studios' first Iron Man. That's the movie that kicked off the MCU, and there is a reason we were all willing to get onto that, go on that journey. When you talk about kind of character development, and you talk about like where does something like arc reactor technology fit into that, the what if they give you is that this is possible, right? Like they're asking you to take that leap of, it's a dirty cave. He doesn't have any advanced tools. He's, but he could do this. So do they set up this world so that you can believe that he would do this? And that is what I love, that I think they do successfully, because you see him have his bona fides as a tinkerer. You see how driven he is. You see how obsessed he is, and as far as like the journey that he goes on, from this guy who is, a philanthropist and perhaps a philanderer. He definitely is very narcissistic. He's flashy. But he's also funny and charismatic and all that kind of stuff. So he's incredible. Like he's just somebody that you want to watch. But because of the fact that he's not just that. Like if he was just that and somebody else was down in his basement lab doing the work, you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. But you see, they go through his history. They establish his history that from a very early age. I mean, there's like a series where they flash all these magazine covers of awards that he won. And then when you also consider the environment he was brought up in, right? So his dad, Howard Stark Industries, had access to all kinds of equipment. And, I'm not saying that like anybody who's brought up in that, and there's like an intersection. There's an intersection between genius and access, and both of those things.
It's scientifically proven, Tamara. It's scientifically proven now. So there's a test that someone did. I forgot. The paper made its rounds. So basically, they were using who gets a patent as the metric to measure scientific success or something like that, right?
Okay.
So who gets a patent? And guess who gets a patent?
Who?
Those who in their childhood were exposed to patent getters. And they also found that it was very granular. If you were a woman and you were exposed to a woman who was a patent getter, it was more likely that you would end up getting passed if you're exposed to a dude who was more, so forth and so on, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting thing. Okay. So exposure, definitely. Tracks. And I would tell you this, as a guy who judged science fairs for many, many years, you go to these science fairs, I was back there in the 20th century with volcanoes, right? Nowadays, the kids are like, oh yeah, I went to my dad's job and I used his ARC reactor for 9 months.
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay, I think you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. We're going to give
Yeah, no, I think that's really important actually, because that gets into issues of not just equality, but equity and how are you building those future STEM kids and those future STEM creators.
the thing I have, the question about the story inside the cave
Yeah.
is the story of necessity, right? So the thing about there's developing technology, and getting things done, but I think your motivation really matters, right?
Yeah.
And he was motivated to save his own life and escape that place he was in. So even if that arc reactor was something like, well, why didn't you do this in the years leading up to it? That'll make you more gazillionaire than anything. Why only now? Because now is the first time my life was at stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so that speaks to, again, like riding that what if train, that makes that what if train go. That makes you want to stay on there because you understand why it's happening at this moment, at this time. So part of what I love is that the bumps that we were talking about before, they use some of those things to actually heighten stories. So for example, like we were talking about palladium, which is reactive, radioactive, and becomes a problem for Tony because it starts to poison him. So like you're not just so you're not just dealing with the shrapnel. So the palladium is what he finds in some of the weapons in the cave. He pulls them out. And so when he makes that first arc reactor that replaces the battery in the casing, it's there. And so he's got
Wait a minute.
What?
No problem having a nuclear reactor in your chest. No problem with energy blasts. No problem having a big hole in your chest. But the palladium poisoning, that's a problem.
No, I said all those things were problems.
I know you. No. In the show, they're not a problem. For us, they are a problem, right?
Oh,
but in the show, they're like, oh no, now there's something that's bad about it.
No, they're all bad things. But I mean, but that's what they use, right? So like they're taking these things and using them. So like they use the fact that it's palladium and it's problematic and that is actually slowly poisoning him. And that leads him to the discovery of a new element that is hidden in a diorama that his dad, I mean, going back to the dad thing, that his dad had hidden basically as a message. And basically the idea is that his dad knew that arc reactor technology was a potential technology. So he had his dad had created this model of the World's Fair display that he'd been in and that he'd done. And there was a secret message for Tony hidden in there that he eventually extracts in digital form. And that's how he finds the new element, the badassium that you referred to, that eventually replaces the palladium. But it's this whole idea that Howard Stark, as you so often like to say, knew what he didn't know, but he knew, and the technology during his time, the particle physics wasn't available for him to be able to create this thing. But he had the idea, and he'd been exposed to the Tesseract. So he was, he had the idea of what potentially could be out there, different kinds of power sources that could potentially work or elements, etc. So we put the message out there for Tony to discover in the future.
And that's not that unusual for the scientists to figure out, oh, here's some new technology. We can't make it yet, but if we ever do, here's how we can use it. So my mentor used to talk about this one technology that we use a lot. It's like the super prism, you spray it light, but it's called a diffraction grating. And so basically what they do is they take a piece of glass and they etch lines into it, right? And so they'll tell you how many lines per millimeter. So it'd be like 5,000 lines per millimeter or something like that, right? And so they each design based on the angle. So light comes in and gets spread out in wavelength, right? And so you can change the angle of the grating and choose the wavelength you want. But here was the thing. These lines have to be equally spaced. So once it was known, it couldn't actually be manufactured until, as my PhD advisor used to point out, it had to wait for the invention of the perfect screw.
Yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
Yeah, well, because there's a cutting edge that makes the line. So the perfect screw, you can turn it like, say, a quarter turn each time, and it moves it this fraction. But every time you do that turn, it has to move the exact same amount because, the
Right.
wavelength of light is so short. And so you had to wait for the perfect screw to be invented in order for you to be able to make a grating, which is now a standard thing. But, there were decades when they just could not be made, just like the arc reactor.
And there's also a parallel to that in filmmaking. So one of my favorite Stan Lee stories, I've been, very privileged and lucky to be able to interview him a couple of times. One of my favorite stories about him is, I said to him, and this was, I honestly don't remember which carpet it was, but it was sort of like, it was very clear that the MCU is now a very successful thing. The movies were out. And I said, how do you feel as, one of the creators of these incredible characters in this world? Why do you think, I know that in the past there have been attempts to make movies out of them, but now there's like this incredible success with them. Why do you think it's happening now? And how does that make you feel? And he said, honestly, I think it's because of filmmaking technology. He said, you have to think about the fact that as comic book writers and comic book artists, we could imagine anything. And all we had to do was put it down with pen and paper and drawing and all of that. And there was no cost that was stopping us. There was no anything we could imagine we could put out into the world. He said that is very different in film, where it costs can cost an incredible amount of money to put your vision for things on screen. He said, I felt like we needed to wait for filmmaking technology to catch up with the visions that we had in our head that we were able to put in the comic books. And
Yeah.
now that can be realized. So it's a very
Yeah.
similar kind of a thing, right? Like you can have the idea for something, but then you sort of have to wait for the tools of the rest of the world to catch up with you.
Ooh, I have another example.
Yeah.
We got editing, so maybe it'll come, maybe the last it wasn't. But this is when the tool is invented and people don't recognize it yet, but then someone recognizes its use. And here's what it was. So astrophysicists knew for a long time that there's a type of supernova that could be used to measure cosmological distances. So basically, there's a type of supernova that explodes when this star always reaches like the same mass. That means that those particular explosions are always about the same brightness. And so the trick with telling distance in space is if you know how bright something really is, based on how bright it appears to be, you can tell how far away it is. But the problem is that no one could predict when a supernova was going to explode, right? So you had no idea where to look to find these things, okay?
Yeah.
Now, remember, all astronomy until like the 90s leading into the 2000s was done on actual photographic film. But when actual digital imaging was created, like the 80s, 90s, actually, when digital imaging was created, there was a technique that no one had thought of. But then this young guy who now has a Nobel Prize in physics, he thought of it. And he's like this. Suppose I take images, just a big region of the sky on one night, and then go back another night later and take an image of the same region of the sky. What you can't do with film, I can now do with a digital image, which is subtract one from the other. And when you do, if anything changed, it's left over, right? So the star, the star's the same day as it was yesterday. When we subtracted it, it ends up being 0. But if you look at a galaxy, if you just look at the naked picture, you can't tell necessarily that a star is exploding in that galaxy. But when you do the subtraction, you see, oh, there's that bright spot. Then you realize, yeah. So just by realizing, oh, with digital images, I can do subtraction. So that reminds me of your movie technology evolution.
Yeah. So basically what this all revolves around, to like put a finer point on it, is this idea of what if, right? Like
what if?
What can you imagine? Are the tools ready for it? Maybe, maybe not. But when it comes to the ARC Reactor and the Iron Man movies, where my brain goes to when it comes to evaluating story is it's a pretty big what if leap, right? You have to it's a train that's going real fast. However, if you jump on that train, if you are willing to suspend some disbelief, I think that the story, which is every sci-fi, because if it weren't, otherwise, it would just be called science. Otherwise, it's science. The fiction piece. How well do they do the fiction? So, my definitive answer of, does the story fly for the ARC reactor is It's a pretty big leap of disbelief that you have to make, or suspension of disbelief that you have to make. But once you do and you are ensconced in that fiction, they do an incredible job. And that is because they use the tech to drive the story. And here's the pun I promised you. They use the ARC reactor to create a story arc for Tony.
Love it.
Ba-dum-bum.
Love it. Boom. A story arc that is up to snuff. It meets your standards
It does.
in terms of
It does.
continuity and everything else. Yeah. Think about first responders. How much of their time do they spend getting kittens out of the tree? How come we never see Iron Man giving nobody a jump at the grocery store because their car battery died? Or, the electricity went out. Iron Man, can you help me out? Like he's a first responder. He's supposed to be there providing electricity. He's never like, I got to go to the hurricane and provide electricity.
So, all right. So is what you're trying to say then that like overall you're sort of feeling like Iron Man / arc reactor / all of it doesn't fly like
Well,
the
I'm
fly?
saying that the writers are kind of ignoring some of the reality of life, right? And when you have something of that nature and how it's going to be called upon. Because right now we're talking about fusion, clean, sustainable, cheap energy for humanity for all time. Yay, right? Well, Tony Stark created that. But you don't really see a world that changes very much.
Well, okay, wait, hold on a second, because I would argue actually, so the world doesn't change yet,
Yeah.
but I would actually argue that that's actually the path that he traverses. I mean, if you look at all of these movies, and again, we're focusing like sort of Iron Man to Iron Man 3 and not beyond, but like the whole story of Tony is how he goes from the guy who's not going to stop and get the cat from the tree to the Tony we meet later and see later is very, very, very different.
He
And all of the
is.
events, yeah, he is.
But I'm talking about society. Like the big thing, remember the big thing is when he says he's Iron Man at the end of the movie?
Yeah.
If he announced I'm Iron Man and also announced I have an ARC reactor, guess which one of those is not news? The ARC reactor existing is going to instantly change all of society.
Well,
no.
but it essentially does. I mean, if you look at the later movies, there are competing factors who were trying to create the Iron Man suits. Like the military's trying to do it.
Yeah, but what about powering society? Like just electricity and, just powering society.
Yeah,
Get
and
rid of
that's
the
what
power
happens
plants.
That's what happens in later movies when
it
he
does.
actually then when he has
He just powers his own house, right?
yeah, but it's got to start somewhere. Like it's not perfect technology. You've got to give it a chance to figure itself out.
I'm detecting some bias here tomorrow. I think you got a crush on Tony Stark. I don't know what's going on.
Who does not have a crush on Tony Stark? I mean, come on.
I know, even I got a crush on
KRS-One
Tony
who sings on a mic.
Singing. He don't exactly sing.
Right. But I think, as you know, scientific progress does not happen overnight. It's not like he says, I have a mini arc reactor, and then suddenly you can completely change the power grid. I think your expectations of society changing are way, way, way too fast.
Yeah. I saw one, a little discussion on YouTube about wheels on suitcases and the time period between when it was thought of and invented to when it was adopted. But the reason why they said was masculinity. Because, men, I'll carry my suitcase. Right? Like men wanted to be seen carrying their suitcase was what this particular thing argued. But I think that, there are many cases where technology is invented and it's not adapted or adopted for widespread use for a long time. But it just seems like when it comes to unlimited clean power, that would, as far as news, that would be instant news. I mean, instant news. Oh man, society. And because think about the Middle East and the issues with oil in the world and the issues with mining coal in the world.
I don't disagree, but also, I mean, let's talk about the environment and let's talk about how long it has taken for clean energy sources to be put into place. Like, let's not forget that if you suddenly come in and say, I have a replacement for all of the current systems, lobbyists. Look at the
Yeah,
existing industries who fight
good
so hard.
point.
I mean, look at there's a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car?
Yeah, I
Which
remember
is
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which is a
yeah,
documentary, which is
yeah.
all about the forces that were anti.
Right.
And I don't
This
pretend
is
to like.
true.
I know there's a lot of different questions about electric cars and the environmental benefits. That's a separate conversation. But the fact that it was a potential solution and the existing industries tried to kill it because it was a competitor. So, it's like you don't go from mini arc reactor to something, especially when you consider how long this time period isn't, right? Like
Yeah,
Iron
yeah.
Man 3 was 2013. I mean, I want to
5
say, and I
years
might be
from
getting
8
this
to 13.
wrong, but I want to say that the ARC reactor was powering Stark Tower in the Avengers, and that was 2012. And then we're only 10 years out. So you go from like a
Yeah,
test case of powering
yeah.
one building, which then didn't go
Right.
so well and got destroyed. You're telling me that 10 years later, you expect the entire energy system
Good
to be
point.
powered and getting rid. So I'm just saying.
Good point. Good point. Now let's talk about this. What if the arc reactor really did exist in our lives,
Mhm.
right? And people could make Iron Man suits. How do you think about such a world? How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's scary, right? Like on one hand, okay, my brain goes to like, I know that DARPA and the military are definitely doing experiments with this because there are so many vets who come back and have limited use of limbs or,
Right. Yeah.
have limited mobility, and to be able to give
Yeah.
that back is
Yeah.
amazing. So like
Yeah.
in that I
Yeah.
go, yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah.
But then when you also think about this, I mean, and we see this in the movies, but when you think about the technology getting into the wrong hands, it's like, yeah,
Right.
it's terrifying. What about you? What do you
Right.
think?
Yeah, yeah, it's very similar. It's very similar. This is one where you can definitely see a lot of good,
Mhm.
but it's again whether or not it gets into the wrong hands, like
Yeah.
smartphones, right? Like
Mhm.
smartphones, we can take advantage of them. People take advantage of them for whatever reasons, but not many people are making an iPhone in their basement, right?
No,
No one is.
no.
No one is building their. Maybe someone
They
is. I
make
don't know, but
I'm sure somebody is trying, but they make it really, really hard, and they're actually trying to get laws passed to make it less hard so that you can
right,
actually repair your iPhone so that you don't have to always buy a
right
new
to
one,
repair.
and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But what I'm getting at is sometimes the technology can be so advanced. Like take for
Mhm.
example, nuclear weapons, fission weapons. They're incredibly easy to make once you have the fissile material, right? The basic designs of it. Any nation state could probably engineer it once they, with sufficient time if they have the fissile material. But getting the fissile material is incredibly hard. So maybe with this arc reactor, it's kind of like with certain weapon systems. They're licensed out, and then you have controls where you can't just do anything you want with it, and it's not like the one I'm using for myself. So maybe there could be some way of controlling arc reactors so that there's a safety mechanism that could turn it off if it gets into the wrong hands. But
Yeah, I mean,
it,
they make a point in the movie, in especially in the first one, of showing
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave.
because he's Tony Stark. But then, there were other pieces that came later that led to
the
perfecting it.
materials
Like,
too,
yeah,
like the palladium, he didn't, he had to
right.
have a particular, yeah.
Mhm. But then you've got Jeff Bridges' character Obadiah Stane, who keeps trying to figure out how to make it to power his
Right.
own suit,
Yeah,
his own
yeah,
weapon,
yeah.
and he has access to some of the best scientists ever in Stark, and they cannot figure it out. And really, the next point where you see somebody figuring it out is in Iron Man 2, when you've got Ivan Vanko Whiplash, who is the son of somebody who actually worked with Howard Stark on some of the original design for it. So it goes back to that access thing we were talking about. So this idea of like making it so technologically advanced that it couldn't be used for bad is, I like that idea.
Yeah, yeah, regulated somehow, but it's so
Mhm.
small. Like, it's one thing to regulate a Patriot battery, but you know,
Yeah.
something that's the size, this a hockey puck, right? That's
Mhm.
that's that's hard, So it's very mobile. People could obtain it, steal it, that sort of thing. But you would
Mhm.
imagine that it would have a radioactive signal, and those are very easy to detect typically.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I guess it could work in our world. So I'm gonna give it a don't fly at all for science, but for the movie, yeah, I could live with it in my world. I dig it in the movie franchise. I
Okay.
like that it evolves through various iterations and
Mhm.
versions. That's very technology. This pioneering technology. It's never you
Yeah.
iterate to perfection, right? He iterates it, comes up with new materials.
Mhm.
I like where he's going with it. I just think that they need to power Earth now.
Yeah, no, I'm down with that. I'm definitely down with that. I mean, if we think about these things existing in our world, I would give it a yes if there's a way to like A, keep it out of the wrong hands,
Yeah.
and B, use it to actually solve our problems.
Yeah. We got to
Okay.
make sure before this rocket flies, we got to make sure the skies are clear, the wind is in the right temperature and blowing in the right direction. And then we'll ignite that fuse.
Light it
So,
up.
you know what? There's a sports podcast I like
Mhm.
until he gets to the end. At the end of every one, he goes, "So, what do you think?" Tell me the exact same phrase at the end of every one. So, I'm
Uh-huh.
going to say, people who are paying attention to this podcast. So, what do you think? Does the ARC reactor fly for you? The science, the story, the feels, and the vibe? Let us know. And remember, click the link, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and send cash.
And you can do all of this at doesitflypod.com, or you can find us on TikTok at doesitflypod, as well as various other places. Hakeem, as always, it is a pleasure riding on the train with you, even when we have
Yes, it
different
is.
opinions.
Yes, it is.